Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Beit Midrash, and a special welcome to some of our new people joining us. Glad to have some new people here. Glad to have some new people learning with us and get some new, fresh perspectives. Excited. So, welcome. Good to learn with y'all, and glad all y'all are here. And I think I even used all y'all properly grammatically in a sentence. So, that's how you know I've been in the South for a bit. Welcome to Parshat Shoftim, our Torah reading. Our Torah reading for this week. As review, especially for the new people, we're reading Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' commentary in Judaism's Life-Changing Ideas, each on his commentary on each Torah reading. That's going to get a little messed up down in a couple weeks. As you know, we get into the high holidays and we're going to miss a class or two here or there, but maybe next week, if I can remember, I will kind of outline what we're doing each of the next couple of weeks. But until we finish the book and have to start something new. So in the meantime, Parshat Shoftim. So before we dive in, wanted to open it up if there was any comments, feedback, thoughts, responses. What did you guys think before I tell you what I think?
I got in trouble with this one this week.
I quoted
the Torah's 3 caveats to the king, to a friend of mine who started on with me about a presidential candidate, and I almost lost a friend. She didn't want to discuss it any further.
Why did she get upset? I'm just curious.
Well, because she was promoting a presidential candidate that I said this needed to apply to, and she didn't appreciate it.
Well, a presidential candidate, I don't think is bound by the same halakha of a president, at least not from a strict halachic perspective, or from a king and a president. I don't think are bound exactly by the same halachot, but at least now I understand where your friend's coming from. Anybody else?
Well, in general, it sounds very well timed. I'll put it that way. Without, as I understand, speaking about politics directly is not generally a part of our discussions, but the problem that is outlined here is timely. I'll just leave it at that. That's what I thought.
Lynn, you look like you were about to say something.
Yeah, when I think about this, the different descriptions of leader, it's really, to me, what the values and the skills that each of us should have in relationships with anyone, to be a good listener, to relate with the values that we've learned, not just history. History is about events and people, but the values that we've learned from our teachers, from Moshe and people like that, and that actually relationships really is it with someone is a form of education, to be able to listen, to respond, to maybe educate, and things. I just think that we all should be servant leaders.
Yes, absolutely. And on some level, I think we're commanded, going back to Exodus, you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy people. There's an expectation that we're all supposed to live up to the highest ideals, and not think, oh, that doesn't apply to me because I'm low, right? But beyond being a king, this is just good personal recommendations, personal lessons of leadership lessons of how do you be a good leader, not even if you're not being a good king, if you're not going to be a king. Unless you're Mel Brooks, good to be the king. Barbara Brandy.
I find that a lot of people are visual learners, and I really appreciated Sacks' paragraph on the last page, on page 273, the first.
That was a cool I
paragraph.
bracketed off that paragraph too. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I drew little things in the margin to show what he's talking about. But I learned that from my own students, that having something visual is really important. And his comparison of his, or the correct style of leadership by comparing the pyramid and the ziggurat to the menorah was just really good. Are you leading, but in control only because the base is wide, or is the leader supporting the base or the people? And I just thought it was a great example, and it really does give a visual perspective. And then you can go, as our architect does, and wonder about which model works for which of the current candidates.
Yeah.
Barbara Aylen.
Take us away from that. And I was struck by the servant idea, because I spent a lot of time working at Protective Life, which was a fairly Christian environment, especially Drayton Neighbors it was very strong Christian when he was a CEO. A lot of just themes came up, and one of them was, I think part of the motto actually Protective was to lead with a servant's heart. And to me, that always sounded so Christian, although I understood the concept of it and I agreed with it. But to hear Sacks say it really, makes me feel good that, oh, it's a Jewish concept. So that was interesting.
It's interesting. There's a couple things. I think servant leadership or servant love is another one, in which I think Jews have kind of backed off on those ideas because they become such big talking points of Christian theology that Jews try to back off of those in order to separate ourselves from the Christians. But they're not exclusively Christian ideas either. They are in Jewish thought. And here you see Rabbi Sacks talking about servant leadership. Rabbi Shai Held of the Hadar Institute put out a book earlier this year called Judaism is About Love, trying to reclaim love as a primary motivator and primary factor in Jewish life and theology, and try to reclaim that for Jews. I think they're right. Like, I think there's a level at which we've kind of pushed that off because we want to separate ourselves, but at the same time, like it's important to who we are too. And I think I've said before too that there's a strain of thought in Judaism that, as much as we talk about moving from slavery to freedom, there's also a level at which we're not exactly moving from slavery to freedom. We're moving from slavery to a human ruler to servants of a divine ruler. And that a big part of the Exodus and the Torah is not that we are completely free. We're bound to the terms of this covenant that we signed on with God. And in that sense, we're servants to a higher king than a human king. And I think that it's a little bit of what Sacks is trying to get at in 272 also, is that same idea as the servant leader, is that the king is not above the law. The king must have his own Torah scroll to make sure that he's following God's Torah as well, and have the humility to understand that he might be in charge of the people, but he ain't in charge.
In one of Rabbi Sacks' other books, he mentions Ezra, he mentions even Ezra, and that even Ezra says that the appointment of the king was permission, not obligation. So the permission does come from what the people want, but it ultimately comes from God.
Yeah, he cites that conversation here as well, in which he cites a little bit of that chapter from First Samuel 8, in which Samuel says the people want a king, and God says, give it to them. It's not you they're rejecting, it's me. But you know what? We have free will. We get to make that choice of what we're going to do. And God's response is tell them what the consequences are, and if they still want that choice, then that's up to them. Margaret?
Yeah, I didn't really get that particular part where it says that it's not you they are rejecting, but me. Because it didn't seem to me that there was any place in which it was saying that a king replaces God.
Well, a king is between kind of the people
Right.
and God.
Exactly. But that is not the same as a rejection, which is why I didn't understand it. It sort of puts another layer into the cake, so to speak, but it doesn't. I didn't see the reason why it said that God was being rejected she whatever had given permission.
And Rabbi, while you're explaining that, also why would it be a rejection of Solomon? Was he not the king, or was he? I don't understand.
I'll start with that one. That one's a little easier. Is that if you read this parsha in Deuteronomy about what the rule of the king is supposed to do, and the parsha talks about the king shall not have too many wives, and the king shall not have too many horses, and the king shall not have too much money, and Solomon breaks each one of these. And the language, if you look at the book of Kings describing Solomon, it's almost word for word, just without the low, like don't. Like almost word for word, Solomon does exactly what Moses in Deuteronomy says, this is what a king's going to do. And almost word for word what Samuel says, this is what the king will do if you decide to have one. The king will abuse his power as king, inevitably. So, you still want it, that's up to you. But this is what's going to happen. And the people say, fine, we're willing to take that risk. Going back to Margaret's question, I think it's a little bit of alluding to what I said before too, is that if you decide to appoint a human king, you're essentially going back to Egypt. You're subjecting yourself to the will of a human ruler who will be able to, who you are giving the authority to decide your fate and to whom you must follow. If you read the Exodus as moving away from a servitude to a human ruler to servitude to Hashem, then the request to hire and to appoint a king makes it our servitude to Hashem is not enough. We need an intermediate. We need a human to tell us what to do. I think that's why God's response is, it's not you, Samuel. Like, it's not your fault. It's me that they're rejecting, not you. That makes sense?
But I like Sacks's thought that it's really not either of them that's rejecting. It's just a flaw in human nature that we haven't gotten to that place where we can control ourselves well enough to not need some physical, real, king or rules or laws that are secular.
Yes, and at this, I'm thinking of it this way. Have you ever sat on a committee in which nobody's really the chair? Nothing actually ends up getting done because everybody's just kind of, talking at each other, and nothing actually gets accomplished. At some point, somebody kind of needs to step up to the leadership position.
Not if you're a Quaker.
Okay, I don't know enough about Quakers to speak intelligently about it, so I'll more or less accept your rebuttal. But
Well, in other words, Quakers, get together and arrive at what they consider the sense of the meeting, and act on the basis of that rather than having the structure.
So another thought that I keeps coming back to me as we have this discussion is that one of Rabbi Sacks's earlier books, I can't remember which one, he wrote that we are all leaders. And I took that to mean that at some point in our lives, each of us has an obligation to step up and take some role of answering the call. I think maybe that's why committeeship is so successful in the Jewish community, because we're all answering the call to one responsibility or another. I don't know, but I just think of that often. I know once I was in Minyan, and it was a Sunday morning. We didn't have 10 because everybody was at the JCC for the barbecue. You remember we used to have an annual barbecue, and one of the congregants was there to say Kaddish for his grandmother who had worked at the JCC, and they were saying, well, should we take the Minyan to the J, or should we just not have it? And I said, I'm the leader today. We're going to the J. Everybody get your talit, your prayer book. And we went to the J, and we had, 40 people for Minyan that day. So I think at some time we can understand leadership better, because at some point all of us need to stand up and take responsibility for leading the group.
I'll say two things to that. I think I'll say three things. One, kol hakavod, well done in doing that. Second, even on a broader scale than that, at some point we all find ourselves in a role of leadership, whether or not we think of it. So, even if it's only becoming a parent, you're kind of de facto part of a leadership structure. You're in charge in some sense. Hopefully you have a good partner to co-lead with you, but you're still in a leadership position. It's not always in an organization or a classroom or a committee or anything else. Sometimes it's just you're with your friends and somebody needs to make the darn decision of where you're going to do. So there's lots of ways that leadership plays out. But as you were talking, I was also remembering there was a conversation I had with in my previous congregation with a past president of my congregation there, who said, they were at an event and he was looking around and said, and turned to, he was in his late 60s at the time, and turned to somebody else who had been really active in the community, had been one of the foundations of the community, who was in his late 80s at the time, and turned to him and said, I don't know what we're going to do. These young people aren't stepping up the way that we did. And I don't know what the future of this community is going to look like when I'm gone, and somebody who's been really active in the community, what's going to happen? Because these young people aren't stepping up to do anything. And the other guy who's in his 80s looked at him and laughed and said, you know what? I feel like I had this exact conversation 30 years ago with somebody who was 30 years older than me. He's like, it'll be fine. It works out in the end. He's like, we sit there and wring our hands about who's going to take over the leadership, who's going to be the leadership. As you said, Diane, at some point, somebody's going to realize this is important and I need to step up to lead it.
But some of the issues that we don't have the humility to recognize that our way of leadership doesn't have to be is not the only way. And therefore, when we see that the younger generation's not doing exactly what we did, we think, oh, no one's doing it, but there just can be a different way.
Well, unless you want to do it forever, then you will wake up. Those are the choices. Either the leader is going to do it forever, or they're going to turn it over to someone who will do it differently, but who will also be successful perhaps differently.
There's a great story that's out there about a longtime rabbi. Rabbi at the congregation who had been at the congregation for 50 years, and everybody loved him. He was wonderful. He was wise. He was compassionate. And he passed away, and they said, well, who are we going to hire in his stead? And so they decided, well, we'll hire his son, because his son must have learned from his father. And so that just seems like the natural reaction. His son will be just like him. And so they hire the son, and the son is nothing like his father. The son is making all sorts of different decisions, all these things counter to what his father said. And somebody went up to the new young rabbi and said, Rabbi, this is not at all what your father would have done. And he said, no, my father taught me to use my own voice. I think I'm doing exactly what my father taught me to do. So yes, there's a level of humility at which you're going to have to let go of your way being the only way. And if you want other people to be willing to step up, you have to perform an act of tzimtzum. You have to self-contract a little bit to leave space for other people to do it differently than the way you do. And that's hard to do.
That's why leaders a good leader can't be so dogmatic. A leader has to be a teacher, so that there won't be the problem that the communities think about succession. Leaders should teach so that there is succession to continue doing the kinds of things that we need to be doing and the growth mindset of our communities.
God willing. But Sacks points out that even that's hard to do. Even that's hard to do, because once you have some of that power, it's hard to let go of that power.
Yeah, I just keep sitting here thinking somebody that to the outside would obviously be a leader who seemed to only be caring about him or herself. And I'm sure that leader is able to rationalize in their own mind that that's not true, that they're doing everything for other people. You know, that's the problem, is reality and what's inside our heads don't always have to match up.
Yeah, they don't. You know, we humans are amazingly good at rationalizing why we're doing something.
We have a list of characteristics of good leaders, so that when we are choosing our leaders, we should be very cognizant of those characteristics. And hopefully, you know, we won't have that problem with people who feel like they're powerful. They have to serve. That's why presidents don't vote, right? In our meetings, right? Isn't that right, Barbara? No.
But
No.
it's also why you have kind of constant turnover, because you know, I'm thinking even politically that we have a limit on presidential terms, because the best person is going to be changed by power, as Sacks says.
So that's why the past president stays on the board to help continue to educate the leadership that follows.
Either that, or it's because now it's their chance to vote. As past presidents, they can have their voice heard. I don't know if you talked about this when I had to take a different phone call, but what I really appreciated was the clarification that that Jewish law separates church and state.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that. I had never thought about that before, but if you think of rules coming from God, not from human beings, or laws, they call them laws, that, yeah, that's an automatic separation. And I think it's a valuable one, but I hadn't ever placed that before.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I've taught it before that there, you know, we don't think of it this way, but the ancient kingdoms had a tripartite structure. There was the king who was in charge of the secular. There was the priest who was in charge of the ritual and the religious. And there was the prophet who was in charge of the morale. And in some sense, they were all kind of subject to each other. You know, the king got to make the laws about and the rules about the kingdom, but the priest still controlled the temple and the ritual laws. And the king, to some extent, was kind of a subject to the priest in that sense. The priest still had to follow the king's laws, and they all had to follow the prophet's morality laws. And that's why nobody liked the prophets, because the prophets just kept telling you you're wrong and you're doing it wrong. That's why nobody likes the prophet. But you know, the prophet was still part of the system also, and still subject to the system also, and had to know what was going on in the kingdom and in the temple to be able to hold them to the highest moral standard. You see that play out in the Bible too, where, you know, the prophets will kind of walk into the king and say, by the way, this is wrong.
Rabbi,
You're cutting out a little bit. It's hard to
can
hear
you
you.
hear me?
Yes.
I know I have problems with internet, but I want to say this is that regarding leadership, the fact that God assigned different people to different leadership, I think is important. I think so often in the Jewish community, you see somebody who's strong in a certain area and you want to put them somewhere else. And their talent is not geared towards that. So I think people need to look at people's talent. And I give a perfect example. When they wanted Condoleezza Rice or Colin Powell to be a presidential candidate, both of them refused because their leadership capabilities was not to be the president. They had talent in the areas that they had previously.
Yeah. Yeah. There were two things I was thinking about as you were saying that, Shirley. I think one was that's why Moses couldn't enter the Holy Land. He wasn't the right leader to lead a conquest. He was the right leader for the people in the wilderness and to lead them out of Egypt, but he wasn't the right right person to establish that society. They needed Joshua to do that. Joshua had a different personality that could do that. But I was also thinking, when does the leadership in the wilderness fall apart? It's when Miriam dies. That's when, Aaron and Moses aren't really able to carry the burden anymore. And then soon Aaron dies after that, and it's just Moses. Moses is the figurehead. He's the authority figure. He's the judge. In some sense, he's the king. He's the one who rules over all the laws of that society in the wilderness. Aaron is the high priest. He's in charge of the rituals. In Miriam, we don't read a lot about, but she's kind of in the background. And so the way I think of it is you need each of those people as well. You need a Moses, you need the authority figure. You need an Aaron who's working behind the scenes to make sure everybody's happy. That's why he's called Rodef Shalom, the pursuer of peace. And then you need a Miriam to support the Moses and the Aaron. You need somebody who's going to support the leaders and help the leaders so that the leaders have someone to lean on and be able to do their job.
I only thought she was important because she was the one who found the water and had the well.
She was important in that sense, but she was a prophetess in her own right. And you have to imagine as siblings that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam kind of leaned on each other. And, you think about right after she dies that the people get thirsty. Yes, but Moses and Aaron don't know what to do anymore once she dies because they've lost their support system as well.
Well, I would put it down to a little bit of anti-female revisionist history that they didn't stress her importance. They gave her the task, or the scribes in rewriting the story to, male scribes, male dominated success, etc. That they gave her the water issue rather than ever coming really out and describing her importance to the community.
So
I wonder if there are any books that reimagine Miriam. I'm aware of some.
I think there are some more modern books, from a feminist perspective, that present it more strongly. But I have a thing against the scribes rewriting stories to fit, their own views.
Well,
Uh,
yes, I know you do, but you know, there are so many books coming out now, feminist views, rewriting of Greek mythology, and so I was just curious if anybody knew of a particular book.
Offhand, I don't. But going back to Barbara's point, nowhere in the Torah does it say that the water belongs to Miriam.
Not that the water belongs to her, but that when she died and there was no more water.
Nowhere in the Torah does it say that.
Oh, is that Midrash?
That's a midrash that the rabbis connected, that the people had water in the wilderness, courtesy of Miriam's righteousness.
And how many of those rabbis were female?
At the time, 0. And I think you're reading this somewhat backwards.
Well, I'm definitely not reading it with an open mind.
I think in some ways the rabbis highlight Miriam's contributions in a way the Torah never does. Which is, I think, the exact opposite point of what you're saying. The rabbis say that, you know, the Torah says that Miriam died, and then the next chapter, the people had no water and were thirsty, and they go to Moses and Aaron. So that's where they connect Miriam as being, well, you know, why did they have no water? Well, because Miriam was the one who provided water for them in the wilderness. And due to her righteousness that they had water. We go back to the beginning with Shifra and Puah. There's the Egyptian midwives who refuse to kill the Israelite babies. There's a midrash that says it's Shifra and Puah weren't really Egyptian midwives; they were Yocheved and Miriam. So Miriam was directly responsible for Moses' salvation, and then Miriam's the one who puts him in the river. Miriam's the one who pops out when Pharaoh's daughter picks him up out of the Nile and says, "Hey, let me find you a nurse for you," and then goes to get her mom. There's a great midrash on she leads the women in song after the Sea of Reeds, and they have timbrels, and they said, you know, the rabbis say, where did they get the timbrels from? Like, why did they have tambourines? Like, there's no reason. And it comes back and says, because it was women knew a miracle was going to happen. They brought it expecting something was expecting that God was going to save them. The men didn't bring the timbrels because they weren't expecting anything. Women were the ones who had the faith to do it. When you get to the golden calf, they say women were not a part of this. So, you know, I understand the patriarchal narrative and that it is a largely patriarchal society that we are dealing with. The rabbis had a largely patriarchal construct. And as I said before, I think it's somewhat unfair for us to judge them by our standards, to judge the past by the standards of the present. Because in some ways, they highlighted the role of women in their midrashim in a way that they didn't have to do. We didn't even get to Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, in which they highlight their roles in different ways as well. So, you know, cut them a little slack. That's all
I keep thinking about, I just read an article this morning about the women in Afghanistan, and it's just so horrifying. And this is now, and it makes you realize that the rabbis didn't do that. I mean, they could have done that. That would have been it seems like it could have been of the time, but yet there was this mutual respect, I think.
And what, there's a great section of Talmud, and why does the ketubah exist as a marriage document? Anybody know?
To
Why
protect
did
the
the
woman.
ketubah develop?
To protect the wife.
So that men could not just randomly throw their wives out penniless on the street.
Mhm.
That if you're going to actually say this marriage is not working, you have to give her enough money to be able to reestablish herself.
Except if you refuse.
Huh?
Except if you refuse to do it.
Except if he refuses to do it, and there's still a lot of work being done to this day in trying to find ways to counteract that and to not allow that to happen. The conservative movement has its way. The Orthodox are still struggling with how to do it from a strict halakhic perspective, but people are still working on it and trying to remedy that problem. Is it a problem? Yes. Is it as widespread as we want to imagine it is? Probably not. But it is a problem, yes. So, yes, there is a level at which the rabbis were patriarchal, and yes, there are ways in which they subjugate women in their lives. But if you're going to point out the flaws, you got to point out the good parts too, and say that just condemning the whole thing for the sake of I don't say a few, but condemning the whole thing for the sake of the parts where they fell short I'm not sure is the right solution.
I don't know that I would say I was condemning the whole thing, meaning, the whole book, 5 books. But I think it's a perspective that is relatively, that's kept quiet. If these writings, not Midrash, but if these writings came in their original form and weren't put down by scribes, the scribes were people too, and they had a certain way of looking at things, and we're still talking about their way of looking at things, even though, as you say, society has changed over time, and conservatives recognize that and change various things. But I appreciate the fact that people are starting to talk about it now. It's not going to change the original writings.
It's not going to change what?
It's not going to change the Torah. It's not going to change the Torah as the Torah. Those stories aren't going to be rewritten and what we have in our Humashi.
Yes and no.
Well, there are slightly different ways that different things get translated, but the basis of the story, I would say it's not going to change.
Yeah, but even before you said, well, the scribes wrote down Miriam's well and as if it was in the Torah.
That was my ignorance. That was my that was that I didn't remember that,
You're right, and that's fine. But I think
that means that in our heads we're mixing Midrash and Torah, which is how we get to some more of the information about the story. Where does Midrash come from? Midrash is also written down by a human who has a perspective.
Which, by the way, is how Jews read the Torah generally. They read it through the lens of the interpretations of the last 2,000 years. And so there's a way to read the Torah that changes through the generations as well. there's a way to read the Torah of where was Sarah during the Akedah. And there are midrashim on that. And you read through them, and you can read them back in as you're reading the Akedah as a way of understanding this is what's actually going on at this moment. That's how we read it. We read a verse and we see it as I understand this is what it's saying, even though that's not exactly what it's saying. We read this verse in this parsha on what the king is not allowed to do, and understand, wait a minute, but Solomon did all these things. And then we understand, because as Sacks points out, we read in the Talmud that Solomon did all these things because he thought in his wisdom he was beyond the law, and he's not. So that's how we do it, is we write the midrashim, we understand the midrashim. I'd be a little more generous than, it's just people writing things. But we read these midrashim and we read it back in and understand that that's what the Torah is trying to teach us as we're reading these midrashim. Yeah, Diane?
So there is an interpretation in our daily service, and I think we read it at other times as well, that is stuck in my throat like a bone. It really chokes me. And that is from the Song of the Sea. We sing, Adonai Ish Milchama. Could you please discuss that? When you're mentioning interpretation, the prayer book says in English, God is a man of war. Now, being a warrior is one thing, but being a man of war, to me, sounds a little bit differently. So I can be a warrior for peace. I can be a warrior for education or compassion, but being a person of war just really is painful for me. So it's your turn to give me your midrashic interpretation of what that really means.
My on one foot answer directly to that verse is there are times that war is a necessary response. And Egypt and God helping Israel escape from Egypt through essentially a spiritual battle is seen, is it problematic? Yeah, I mean, there's the fact that Egypt had to suffer and had to lose life for the sake of Israelites' freedom is tough to swallow. And it's supposed to be tough to swallow. But knowing that God will fight for us when necessary should not be as problematic for us. To know that God is willing to go to war for us, particularly for those who are coming out of the Sea of Reeds, should be a source of comfort and a source of excitement, not a source of misery. The other thing I will say is, we're in Elul now, so I can start talking high holidays. Is one of my favorite piyutim, one of my favorite poems in the entire Machzor is Kianu Amecha. There's a lot of images of God in that piyut. there's a lot of images of who God is, and they're sometimes self-contradictory. I often understand that piyut is in any good, strong relationship, you don't always need the same thing from the same person all the time. Sometimes I'm really angry and I just need to call my best friend or my wife and just vent because I'm angry about something. And I don't need advice. I don't need solutions. I just need to get it off my chest. He does it to me too. Don't worry, it goes both ways. Sometimes I don't know what to do and I'm actually asking for advice. And that's okay too. And sometimes I just want to hug and I just need comfort. Sometimes I just want her to make me laugh. We need different things from different people at different times. And I think in some sense, that's what Kianu Amecha is trying to tell us, is that whatever you need from God, God is there for you for it. And sometimes we need an ish milchama. We need somebody who's going to go to battle for us. And we need to know that we're not alone in doing it. How'd I do on one foot?
You stood a long time.
Margaret, I'm a rabbi. I can talk for a while.
This is a little bit veering away, but I don't, Torah is teaching. And to me, this is Torah as well as what is written down in that book that we read each week. So I think I feel a little bit less, I guess, tied to some of the ancient things in the Torah, because we have continuing Torah. Some of it's written down in the Mishnah and so on and so forth, and then some of it is just our speaking with each other at times and places like this.
Ben ve'amen. We are B'nai Yisrael. We are the descendants of one who wrestles with God. This ain't supposed to be easy. If it was easy, everybody would do it. It's supposed to be hard. And it's supposed to challenge us. And it's supposed to require us to think and argue and debate and sometimes not come to a conclusion and sometimes not convince each other that I'm right. It's supposed to be, in this sense, God is found in the wrestling that we do together more than in the text itself. Barbara, do you have
I do, and you need to put on your rabbi hat again and do some counseling here. How well or how clearly do you express to your friend, to God, to your wife, what it is that you need? Do you say, I only want comfort? Do you say, okay, let's hear your answer? Yeah. Or do you expect God to guess?
So, when I'm talking to Orly, sometimes there are times I'm pretty explicit. I'll call and say, can I just vent for a minute? And she'll say, sure. Or I'll say, hey, can I get your advice on something? Or can I get your feedback on something? And so she knows kind of, okay, this is the switch I need to turn on for the moment. And there are times where I dote and she's like, do you just need a hug? And I'm like, yes. At least in terms of God, um, as you guys know, I'm more of a mystic than I am of a rationalist. So, I think of the Hasidic, the variety of Hasidic stories, including one where, kid goes with his father to services, and in the middle of services, he's reciting the Aleph Bet just over and over and over again. The father says, "What are you doing? Like, open the prayer book, say the prayers." And the kid goes, "Well, I'm reciting the Aleph Bet. God knows what I want. God will arrange the letters the way that God knows I need to arrange the letters." So, I say the words on the page of the Siddur, and God knows what I'm thinking about it as I'm doing it.
And does God always give you the right answer?
What is the right answer?
That's between you and God.
I laugh because little known fact of Rabbi Elliot Dorff is that he's a huge country music fan. And one of the songs he used to play for us, I forgot the exact name, but I think it's a Garth Brooks song. It's Thank God for Unanswered Prayers. And the whole song basically revolves around, different points in his life where he's young, he's a teenager sitting in the back of his truck with his girlfriend and says, God, I want this to last forever. Like, please just make this last forever with me and her together. And they don't, and they break up. And he says, you know what? She went and married this guy, and I married this other woman, and my life is so much better than it would have been if I ended up with her. And he goes through a whole series of things in which, God said no. And he's like, but you know what? My life is better because of it. So does God hear what I want? Yes. Is it always the answer I want to hear? No. Is it sometimes the answer I need to hear? Probably, God willing. But sometimes it's not what we want, it's just what has to happen. And sometimes our lives are better for it, sometimes they're not, but sometimes it's what needs to happen anyway. And we have, sometimes the lesson is in trying to just accept and come to terms with, this is where we are. I think we have veered somewhat from Rabbi Sacks, but that's okay too. Any concluding thoughts? I think Lynn stole my go home thought before, but as we pick leadership in whatever capacity we think of leadership, and in the different situations in which we look at leadership, let us make some of these values that the Torah is trying to teach us of what maybe not just a king, but a leader in general. What are the values that will help that person be the best leader? And let us support those people who best exemplify those values. Which Lynn said beautifully before. I think I said probably with more words, but any final thoughts?
Thank you very much.
Thank y'all very much. Kol hakavod. Thank you for learning together. Next week, Ki Tetzah, or Ki Tetzeh, rather. Social Capital and Fallen Donkeys. Sounds like a great title for a chapter. So we'll read it for next week and discuss it then. But if I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom. Wishing everyone a peaceful and a restful Shabbat. And I hope to see you before next week, but if not, I'll see you next week. Good to have some new people here, and hope y'all will keep coming back too.
Thanks for letting me join.
Anytime. Be well, everybody. Take care.